The story of international relations between the United States and Africa has never been a simple one. For decades, the policies coming out of Washington have often oscillated between engagement and neglect, opportunity and restriction. One of the most controversial policies in recent years was the visa crackdown imposed by former U.S. President Donald Trump, which targeted a number of African nations under the banner of immigration control and national security. This decision sparked not only anger and disappointment among millions of Africans, but also set the stage for a broader conversation about sovereignty, respect, and Africa's place in the world. At the heart of this story is the bold and increasingly influential leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, who did not shy away from addressing what many saw as a deeply unjust policy. His response was more than just a political statement. It was a symbolic declaration of Africa's determination to resist external pressures and chart its own course. To understand the significance of Traoré's reaction, we must first revisit the context of Trump's Africa visa crackdown. The policy, framed as an extension of earlier travel bans that targeted several predominantly Muslim countries, was justified by the Trump administration as a matter of national security. Officials argued that some African countries failed to meet certain standards of information sharing, identity verification, and security cooperation, thereby posing risks to the United States. Yet behind this technical language lay a much more profound message: that entire populations from sovereign African nations were to be treated with suspicion and denied access to opportunities in America. Regardless of individual merit or circumstance, the move was perceived across Africa as an insult. For many, it was less about visas and more about dignity. Families were separated, students lost their scholarships, professionals were blocked from pursuing careers abroad, and business ties were disrupted. The ban not only impacted individuals, but also sent ripples through economic and diplomatic channels. African leaders, while cautious not to provoke direct confrontation with Washington, expressed concern over the precedent such policies set. Yet among them, Ibrahim Traoré's voice carried a particular resonance. Traoré, known for his fiery speeches and unapologetic stance against what he calls neo-colonial practices, framed the visa crackdown as part of a broader pattern of Western condescension toward Africa. In his public addresses, he argued that the policy was not simply about immigration, but about control. To him, it symbolized the enduring imbalance in global power, where African nations are often subjected to unilateral decisions that undermine their sovereignty. By striking back rhetorically and diplomatically, Traoré tapped into a deep well of frustration felt by millions of Africans who had long endured being sidelined in international decision-making. His response was not limited to words. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso began strengthening alliances with other African nations also affected by the ban. The message was clear: Africa must present a united front when confronted with policies that demean or disadvantage its people. This push for unity resonated strongly across the continent. Traoré reminded African youth that their destinies should not hinge on visas to the West, but on their ability to build opportunities at home. His rhetoric highlighted the need for investment in local education, technology, agriculture, and industries, so that leaving the continent would no longer seem like the only path to success. The symbolic power of this stance cannot be overstated. At a time when many African leaders chose caution, Traoré embraced confrontation, not in the sense of hostility, but in his insistence on respect and reciprocity. He argued that if the United States imposed restrictions on Africans, then African governments had every right to reconsider how they engaged with American corporations and institutions operating on their soil. It was a provocative idea, one that challenged decades of asymmetrical relations between Africa and the West. Critics of Traoré questioned whether his fiery words risked alienating powerful allies or jeopardizing aid and trade relationships. But supporters countered that Africa had long been asked to compromise in exchange for promises of assistance that often came with strings attached. For them, Traoré's defiance represented a long-overdue correction, a demand that Africa be treated not as a subordinate, but as an equal partner in global affairs. To appreciate the depth of Traoré's strike back, one must also understand the symbolism embedded in immigration itself. Migration between Africa and the West has historically been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it has allowed African students to gain education abroad, families to find better livelihoods, and professionals to connect with international markets. On the other, it has often resulted in brain drain, with talented individuals leaving their home countries permanently. By responding to Trump's visa crackdown with a call for self-reliance, Traoré reframed the narrative. He turned a moment of exclusion into an opportunity to highlight Africa's untapped potential and the importance of retaining talent on the continent. This does not mean that Traoré dismissed the pain and disruption caused by the ban. He openly acknowledged the struggles of families torn apart and dreams deferred. Yet he insisted that such struggles should fuel determination rather than despair. By portraying the visa crackdown as a challenge to African pride and unity, he shifted the debate from one of victimhood to one of empowerment. This rhetorical shift had far-reaching consequences. It inspired activists, students, and entrepreneurs across the continent to view their future less through the lens of Western approval and more through the possibilities within their own nations. Internationally, Traoré's stance drew mixed reactions. Some Western observers saw his words as inflammatory, an unnecessary escalation in an already tense diplomatic climate. Others, however, recognized the legitimacy of his concerns. After all, blanket restrictions on entire nations rarely achieve their intended security goals. Instead, they often breed resentment and hinder cooperation. By pushing back, Traoré forced a wider conversation about the fairness and efficacy of such policies. He reminded the world that Africa was no longer content to be a passive recipient of decisions made elsewhere. Beyond politics, Traoré's strike back also carried economic implications. Burkina Faso and its allies began exploring ways to diversify their partnerships, seeking stronger ties with emerging powers such as China, Russia, and regional African blocs. This diversification sent a message that Africa was no longer dependent on the West for validation or survival. It underscored the continent's agency in choosing its partners and setting its own priorities. The visa crackdown, ironically, accelerated this pivot by highlighting the risks of over-reliance on any single foreign power. Domestically, Traoré's response bolstered his image as a leader who speaks truth to power. For the people of Burkina Faso, his willingness to challenge Washington reinforced his credibility as a defender of national pride and sovereignty. This credibility was especially important in a region where populations have grown disillusioned with leaders perceived as overly deferential to Western interests. By standing firm, Traoré distinguished himself as a voice of authenticity, one who prioritized the dignity of his people over diplomatic niceties. Of course, no leader operates in isolation. The effectiveness of Traoré's strikeback depended on the support of his fellow Africans. Fortunately for him, the broader climate across the continent was shifting. From Lagos to Addis Ababa, from Dakar to Nairobi, there was a growing appetite for leaders who could articulate Africa's frustrations and aspirations without fear of offending powerful outsiders. Traoré's defiance tapped into this sentiment, making him not just a national figure, but a continental symbol of resistance and renewal. At the same time, it would be simplistic to portray this as a mere clash between Trump and Traoré. The issues at stake were far larger than two individuals. They reflected the structural inequalities that have long shaped the global order, where African voices are often marginalized in forums that affect their future. By speaking out, Traoré was challenging not just one policy, but an entire mindset. He was calling for a rebalancing of global relations, one in which Africa is recognized not as a problem to be managed, but as a partner with legitimate interests and contributions. As the debate unfolded, the world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Visa bans and similar policies are not just bureaucratic measures. They are deeply political acts that signal how nations perceive one another. When the United States restricted African travelers, it sent a message, whether intended or not, that African nations were not trusted partners. Traoré's strikeback was therefore about reclaiming trust, not by pleading for inclusion, but by asserting that Africa's dignity was non-negotiable. Looking back, the confrontation over Trump's Africa visa crackdown marked a turning point in the relationship between Africa and the West. It revealed both the fragility and the resilience of these ties. For Africa, it was a wake-up call about the need for self-sufficiency and unity. For the United States, it was a reminder that policies made in Washington can have profound ripple effects across the globe, shaping perceptions and alliances in ways that are not always predictable. The question that remains is what lasting impact Traoré's response will have. Did his defiance create real policy changes, or was it primarily symbolic? While the tangible outcomes may be debated, the symbolic victory is undeniable. He demonstrated that African leaders could no longer be ignored or dismissed when their people were disrespected. He showed that even a relatively small nation like Burkina Faso could punch above its weight in the arena of global politics when led with conviction. Ultimately, the story of Trump's visa crackdown and Traoré's strike back is a story about dignity, sovereignty, and the ongoing struggle for equality in international relations. It is a reminder that policies are never just about paperwork or procedures. They are about people, identities, and the power dynamics that shape our world. And it is a story that continues to resonate as Africa seeks to define its future on its own terms, free from the shackles of external dictates. In this sense, Ibrahim Traoré's response was more than just a reaction. It was a vision of an Africa that refuses to be demeaned, that refuses to be silenced, and that insists on its rightful place at the table of nations. Whether that vision is fully realized remains to be seen, but its articulation has already altered the conversation. It has reminded both Africa and the world that respect is not granted by visas or bans. It is earned by the unwavering determination of a people and their leaders to stand tall in the face of adversity.